No, I want that. I just use the regular slides. I want to just go myself. Okay, yeah. Yeah, if you want to run the PowerPoint for you so you can see. Yeah,
Ladies and gentlemen, be upstanding for the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. A Uachtaráin, a Ghine Uisle, a Chairde. Tá faran na fáilte rómh ag an ácaid special seo, chun síl agus síthar Brigid, Reynolds agus Seán Healy a cheilliú. President, ladies and gentlemen, friends, you're all most welcome to this special occasion to celebrate the contribution made by Brigid Reynolds and Seán Healy to the cause of social justice in Ireland over many decades. My name is John McGeady. I am the new CEO of Social Justice Ireland. I have the great privilege of taking over from Seán and Brigid, and I can say that they have shown great generosity during this period of transition since I took on the role in September. And I'm also glad to say that they're going to continue with that great generosity and continue to support the Board of Social Justice Ireland into the future. We have a number of speakers here today. Catherine Kavanagh, Micheál Collins, who will be joining us by video link, Tony Fahy, who himself is chair of the Board of Social Justice Ireland, Dermot McCarthy, and Michelle Dillon. We look forward to an excellent number of presentations from our speakers on the question of social justice in Ireland, the social justice movement, a 50-year view. But before going on to those speakers, I am very, very pleased to welcome President Michael D. Higgins to give an opening address. Uachtaráin.
An gedaltjas mille buikas sprivleid venture, mar in our areas are called specialty, agus muidig toort, ahantas over intactovuk tak proniak, a quiragamake Seán Healy, agus an tour British. Ma buikas the Tony Asachtan quira hill shetab, agus Tasulam, Gwim Gokragus. May I just say it's a great pleasure, a great privilege to have been asked to be here on what is a very, very special occasion. That is, we give recognition and gratitude too to courageous work by two remarkable people, John Healy and Sister Brigid. And I must say, as I might say in Irish, Gimgach Ragas Launcha Ariftas Tablinta, a Meshiv, a Kahav, Errol Honhain. I so wish you for the years that you will have, for your responsibility for yourselves, may it be ones of health and happiness. I do thank President Tony Fahy then for giving me this privilege. I welcomed the opportunity when I got his note to have to be able to applaud, as I have said, the contribution of two remarkably socially engaged citizens who have done so much over the course of half a century with tenacity, and also something that was desperately needed in relation to advocacy, the gathering of evidence, and perseverance in research, publishing, campaigning for a more just Ireland, indeed for a more just world. One of the things you have always to do, I think, in listening to speeches now, when people speak about people's contribution to the just society we have now, which of course I don't do because it is not so. There is a lot of work yet to be done, and it's always much better to, in fact, actually recognize efforts that are efforts at a process that is yet to be completed. When I think of Dr. Seán Healy and Sister Brigid Reynolds, who are retiring today from the positions of Executive Company Secretary, I often think as well of the quality of endurance that is required, perceived as you might often be, as the soft side, as somebody would say. And that why, for example, as I always remember myself coming on a train from Galway once, one of my former students who had managed to become rather wealthy, and he was getting off the train in the car to go to the races. And his phrase to me was, "And you're still at it, Michael, too." And this, in a sense, actually taught me an awful lot. I often thought about him since. I think that the notion that this is somehow or another a kind of moral activity that is less than tough economics. We're in a very good shape now. The tough economics has been exposed as a failing paradigm by practically every criterion, be it environmental, social, justice, or whatever. And then as well, it has imploded on itself and its inability to even justify some of its decisions. I think that the work that Seán Healy and Brigid Reynolds put in, for example, let us take one of the perhaps insufficiently recognised institutions we have in Ireland, is the National Economic and Social Council. Most qualified people with research that is refereed independently and have achieved an extraordinary capacity to be able to do so in collaboration with all of the major partners of society and the economy. I think that work that was put in relation to NESC was incredibly important, but of course when one thinks about, if you like, the large number of publications that are there, they're on issues dealing with taxation, the labour market, housing, poverty, income adequacy. I think when I began looking at there are 20 books on public policy that they have written together. So let's recognise that, give a clap to that straight away. You see, as I've said, there is something that was very important, and I was thinking about what contribution I might make to this, having been more or less around for most of the time myself. I think their focus on poverty as an aspect of human rights was very important, and indeed also about the importance of understanding poverty, its extinction, its elimination, as an aspect of the public good. Now this is something that, of course, unfortunately I'm not free to stay on in the afternoon, but a number of the papers are dealing with the moral content of this, which I'm very, very interested in. I believe we're living through some of the most immoral times. Its absence, very absence to detect, and I might say a word on that in a moment, in a way. But I think giving a voice to those who are not having a voice, I'm beginning to be a bit uncomfortable, because it isn't that people haven't heard the message, rather it is that they have worked so hard to refute it. And I think it's time we started putting it like that, because we're in new circumstances about the presentation of inequality. What I think when I think of the work of the pair of them now, looking back, and I use the word endurance, I wasn't being patronising, but what it was a concerted narrative that was something that questioned a kind of lazy, descriptive, or even stronger tendency to see that tendency that suggested that gradualism was all that was available by way of strategy and that might be achieved. And there is an interesting thing in Ireland people don't want to often recognise, and that is that if you're not committed to making the analysis or to being open to discussing alternative policy, you're just dealing with poverty becomes rather the action of a voyeur. And at times when I was over my time dealing with these poverty issues, it was that people like to be moved regularly by gross poverty, to just have that few moments and then move on. But nothing changed in themselves, nothing changed in the institutions, nothing changed in their conversations, their company, their advocacy. The work of Seán, Healy and Brigid Reynolds on poverty was, I think, moved it into the main frame of economic discourse as well, particularly on the metrics of poverty and on the importance of having a shared understanding. More than now, in many ways, market economics is the weak part of the field, whereas the good economics of Europe and the world, in many cases, is that it is able to engage, that actually has an empirical base, that is able to justify itself. But acknowledging that is tough for a number of people who've benefited from the alternative. I think their work has been, their leadership, so as President of Ireland, I so want to acknowledge that. That's what I said. Today is about acknowledging. The promotion of and development of an inclusive, equitable society in everyone's right and dignity are recognised and known. It shouldn't be a controversial idea. One would think in a constitutional republic where equality as a value has reference. And yet the work needed now more than ever still remains. It isn't only that inequality is deepening, but that its beneficiaries are ever more concentrated. It is that the discussion space for challenging this is actually becoming less available and less accountable and less accessible. If I was asked, looking back on it, to say the 1990s was the period, for example, where human rights was at its strongest. I remember attending meetings. Mary Robinson was a rapporteur at a meeting we had in Vienna in which we were discussing the extension of the human rights perspective. The 90s was a very, very promising period for human rights. We are now in one of the worst periods in relation to human rights. We have blatant actions that are taking place. But the difference is that we all know about it. It's on our television screens, and we have our choice as to what we want to do about it. I want to refer to a recent report from Oxfam, Inequality Inc., which is on the contemporary expression of the deepening inequality. That publication is a damning indictment of not just an indictment of a failed paradigm, one that has enabled a yawning inequality that we in so many parts of the world. But remember, people still have not dropped the notion of progress, and I think that is interesting. I have to say, at this stage of my life, I think I really want to be quite candid about it. If you take it that the two richest people in the world felt that they might get an audience for having a fight in a cage, and the people took this kind of how are they preparing for it and so forth. It is actually, there is a degraded quality to, as I said, they're very much, what has happened is the wealth is not new value of any kind. It is concentrated. It's more through really acquisitions and mergers and so forth. And we have in today's papers, as I said, and I won't get distracted anymore, as to whether or not Elon Musk is entitled to a $55 billion per performance-related compensation. In a society that was morally sensitive, you would imagine that there would be some kind of a reaction, but there isn't very often. So Pope Francis is entirely right when he speaks about, for example, the epidemic of indifference. And people are indifferent to this rather just awful stuff, really. Now, but Oxfam's report is an indictment of how corporate power has come to divide our world. I was listening, Bernie Sanders is due to visit me soon, but I was trying to look into his recent interview in which he's saying he's very pessimistic. More or less says we just have to keep fighting. Someone else has written a book, I think under the title, Until We Fall. But I think the recent interacting crises, we are now, there's no doubt at all about that issues of global poverty, issues of climate change, issues of dispossession, issues of ugly responses to migration are all connected. And they are based on that gulf between those, for example, who might want to meet the necessities of life and those who really find nothing wrong at all with the most ostentatious, vulgar, stupid presentations of their wealth. I think that the Oxfam report describes what is a fundamental choice, really, between people continuing to accept lives of a new billionaire supremacy. It's very, very interesting that side of the argument had more representatives at COP28 than did the advocacy for the environment or for equality. They are the 10 times better represented at the Commission in Europe and Brussels. They are actually in that spectacle of Davos. They interview each other. And but I think what Oxfam's most recent statistics tell us, if you like, is really the more glaring side of it all. That, for example, that the 5 richest people in the world are men who have fortunes that have more than doubled during the pandemic, and they have 5 billion people have seen their wealth fall during the pandemic. Globally, men own about $105 trillion more wealth than women. The difference between wealth and this raises another interesting question. Should that mean that women should aspire to have an equal kind of life as the men that I have referred to? And of course, the answer is no. And yet when I look, because I've been working quite a bit recently on food security in Africa, I have people telling that the approach to African women should be that you can be Africa's first billionaire, the second billionaire, among the top 20 billionaires and so forth. This is why women are this is why children are starving, and women are, with ever less security, gathering faggots to light fires and so forth, and of course, without even referring to what is happening at the present time. 70% of women and children are of the 27,000 people who have just lost their lives in Gaza. And this isn't kind of any envy or anything like that. It is actually, if you were, as I, at this stage of my life, have to ask myself fundamental questions as to the place, and it's rather one of the points in relation to philosophy you would ask, as to ratio and rationality and so forth. And could you not say, as you looked at the biodiversity losses across the other species of life on the planet, that we're actually a failed species? Perhaps then, in many cases, what was it was missing in relation to the senses, in relation to the full capacity of the human body that was lost? The world's richest 1% own 43% of all global financial assets. This raised a question in relation to those of us in the history of economic thought. Did it is the case that as the definition of the economy became ever more abstract, it became more artificial, and of course so far less accountable. The richest 1% own as much as, I think, own 43% of all global financial assets, and the richest 1% globally emit as much carbon pollution as the poorest 2/3 of humanity. In the United States, the wealth of a typical black household is 15.8% of that of a typical white household. One of the richest economies in the world. Of course, so much of its expansion at the moment built on the production of armaments. In Brazil, on average, white people have incomes that are 70% higher than those of Afro descendants. 0.4% of 1,600 of the world's largest and most influential companies are publicly committed to paying their workers a living wage and support payment of a living wage across their value chain. These statistics tell us so much about the assumed abstract ethical foundations of our taken for granted failed paradigm of profit, consumption and accumulation, one which has been promoted for over for 4 whole decades as a virtuous model of economic development that rewarded and penalised justly. It was a paradigm that emphasises the individual privatised experience of the economic over any collectively transcendent version of social welfare, of shared welfare, or economic security and sustainability. And yet these words have that bit of distance too, because I've been more interested in something that Seán O'Casey said. When literary people write about poverty, Seán O'Casey said, it is like a disease of the bones. It never leaves. And equally, I saw a study in one of those visits I made to Palestine of children in thousands. It was thousands of children in Palestine. And they spoke of something important. It was about humiliation. And that is what O'Casey had. O'Casey has said in about the disease of the bones. It is a remembered humiliation that never truly leaves you. And when I saw that study of the thousands of children, I remember it so well. Recalling their parents being humiliated made a greater contribution to their trauma than the death of either of the parents. And that is, in the end of the day, what is happening in relation to those who are, in fact, speaking about this world that must only change and adjust. Another part of it, which we are now faced with, is in relation to the two great issues we have in relation to, let us say, climate change, and the one I work on myself on food security. The camp is completely split. Those best endowed, those most represented at COP28 and all of the others, are those who say we can deal with climate change through a market adjustment. I have exactly the same opposition to what I'm working on in relation to food security. For example, can we go on and simply do an adjustment in relation to it says that where 70% of the fertilizers are going to come from Russia, where if you add the Ukraine and Russia together, you get 68% of all the wheat that is transported to parts of Africa. 10 years ago, 7 companies controlled 40% of all the seeds that are planted in Africa. Today it is 2 companies, because the 7 have the internal acquisitions and so forth. And that argument is a very, very difficult one to make, because even for me, as President of Ireland, I have difficulty in trying to say who decided that 40% of the young people under 20 in Africa can have only 3 sources of food, wheat, rice and maize. When I look at the anthropology, the physical anthropology of it, the people of Africa have used 7,000 sources of food. Why, therefore, you can see, on one side you have those of us who are saying we are in favour of breaking dependency. We're in favour of creating sufficiency. We are in favour of trying to bring a new form of economic model into existence. And on the other, the dominant vision, with the most support, is one that it must be adjustment and so forth. And all of this, I only say all of this to say what a contribution it was to Seán Healy and Sister Brigid to the literacy of the public, to be able to say, you must be involved in these conversations and you must arm yourself with empirically based facts, and then you will be able to bring about the change. And that is why they did it for half a century, and that is why we are correct today in paying tribute to them. Tom, is it possible to do differently? Yes, of course it is. I have been describing the impact of a paradigm that is failing and recognised all over the world now, except in the most obdurate places as having failed. There are alternatives. Thomas Piketty's work is a very, very clear example. I think that, and that is the good news. The good news is that work is now moving into the mainstream. People can't ignore it. But I want just a word about, allow myself up, because I was around at the time when poverty was discovered in Kilkenny in 1974. And at that meeting, which had a very dear friend of mine who shared a class with me in University of Cork, Seamus O'Kinnead, that was there, he would continue the work afterwards, and so forth. And I so clearly remember that. And then after that as well, why? There had been, which tribute must be paid to them, I think. Newsight had published, Declan Burke Kennedy had published work, Vincent Browne had published Newsight, and then there was, of course, the remarkable work of Mary Raftery. And that was showing images that people, for example, didn't want. It shocked people. I remember it very, very clearly. I was in my 30s. People couldn't believe it. And then at the same time, I had been in the United States, and the Johnson program had introduced Head Start and so forth, which was an intervention scheme in relation to black families. It had massive problems, but it was there, and a discussion took place on what would we perhaps on combat poverty. I remember the discussions with Flora Manley and Frank Lusky on combat poverty, their trips to America and their trips to Europe, and I remember it being set up. From the very beginning, it was contested. And it was contested because of a view of the Irish state and the Irish public service. And the debate was very strong in England. And it was, you had a kind of, they were moving towards the Tories, and they were saying, these people should be grateful for what we're giving them. And instead of that, they're actually hiring experts to come and contest with us. The idea that you had a person at the other side of the bench that would be asking you questions. Why, for example, what does it mean to be saying, did you have visitors when you were kind of drawing the benefit of being living alone and so forth? And you should be interrogated. And that's where this afterness thing is very, very important, about the people who travelled for a long, long time on their notion of the deserving poor and the note and all the rest. As I said, much of their work was voyeuristic. It is to this day. The idea that you kind of every now and again they want to kind of get an injection of concern to keep themselves half moral. But it doesn't work because the system says the same. I think that in that time, combat poverty, when it was established in Ireland, I was teaching social policy at the time. I was drawing the work of Professor Richard Titmuss, I remember very, very much. Richard Titmuss, there is a moral example for dying of cancer in a public hospital in the British National Health Service and writing an essay in his last day saying, what a wonderful thing it is to be dying here in a ward, treated equally like all of the other people around me. And that stuck with me. I remember very, very, very much what an example that was. But from the very beginning, combat poverty, because I should immediately say, 4 of my own graduates worked in that programme in different parts of Ireland. They did innovative things, and it was rather something similar that happened in relation to work by Catherine McGuinness. Catherine McGuinness had produced a very important paper on what is the role of the voluntary sector in identifying where the state isn't reaching or where the state might have missed something and so forth. And that work was there. From the very beginning, the idea was this is calling us, the appointed bureaucracy, into question. And they got rid of it. Combat poverty was ended as part of the responses to the austerity program. But remember that every government department has little pieces that were offered up as sacrifice. The Department of Foreign Affairs was spending $60,000 a year on a United Nations association. That was ended. We are today one of the small group of countries in the world that doesn't have a United Nations association. Why? Because we know who should be giving the messages on the United Nations, and you can stay out. Next, we had a kind of a thing about it. But I do want to say where the debate is now. A slight difference I have with Seán Healy, and that is that he is a wonderful advocate for universal basic income. I am an advocate for universal basic services. And these are not binary choices. In fact, what we must do, it will be the greatest achievement, I think, in social economics when we have made the adjustment between the two. Why, in relation to the universal basics, of course, the universal basic income, what it does, my reference earlier to humiliation, it gives dignity. it gives participation. It gives a sense of being the citizen. It enables you to participate fully. I entirely agree. When I mentioned about universal, my problem about universal basic services is this, is that dealing with all the different 60 crises around the world we have at the present time, hunger is very near the start of most of them, which leads to migration, which leads to contested space, and it leads then to other movements. And if one, for example, in relation to where 40% of the people under 20 are on the continent of Africa, if one, for example, had basic food, if one had shelter, if one had the security of tenure of some kind of plot or whatever, you can actually meet the universal basic services. In a way, it's a wider platform than, in fact, the notion and the idea. But they are actually, they will merge. There's universal basic income and universal basic service consciousness and movements. I think that just think of what a force it would be if the ecological movement, the feminist movement, the basic justice movements have a kind of consciousness that can be merged. I think that in relation to this, I say thanks again and again to the people whose lives we're celebrating today. There are people, for example, who are, for example, Manu Shafiq is among a diversity of scholarly and spiritual thinkers and writers who are presenting a compelling case for this new social contract between the citizen and the state. Myself about it is that some people would say that most cultures across the planet have been created on the resolution of contradiction that can't be resolved, and that is the brevity of physical life and the infinity of imagination. But it is, and it's one of the things that is very, very important, that we do now have very new good work that is there, and it is very promising. There has been there for some time, Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, but I think that one of the problems has been the problem about what is missed. A great deal of oppositional thinking has confronted the state, and it hasn't, in fact, it has missed out on the more dangerous corporate power. The state, in some respects, could be confronted and made accountable. The biggest danger to democracy, to all of the issues and all of the issues I've mentioned, is unaccountable corporate power. As I said, it has actually, in its wild phase, you have actually two extraordinary rich people who say that you can afford, without shame, to say to the world, we're going into a cage to fight with each other. And enough of that. But the point about it is that there are, I think, when I last spoke to Social Justice Ireland, it was in 2017, we had come out of a period in which the state was, in fact, the state had been forced out. There had been an assumption. Many public servants had been told, you are lesser than anything of what's happening in the private sector. So therefore, public medicine can't be possibly as good as private medicine. Public transport can't be as good as private transport. The state, and there is a long, inglorious history in Irish history about the attitude to the state. It is not the notion that we somehow or another have evolved into some new perfect condition, and we would be saying, well, maybe we should acknowledge it more, how much we have come and everything. Oh, we have everything. I actually find some of it amusing, because when I was preparing material into the 1920s, say the 1923 Land Act, it was fascinating to read, and humorously I say it, on the transition from caps to hats. With the 1923 Land Act and a few more acres, people went for the hats. And you get that old Irish song, it's Almadon at Cossin, Capian, and my love will wear a hat, and so forth and so forth. But in part of it all was this notion about it is, when Ireland was welcomed into the different international bodies, what do people say? We now have a new ally, people who will oppose communism like we ever opposed it before. So Ireland was there with its conservative, backward view in relation. There were hardly any communists in Ireland, but it was important to burn down the headquarters before the people moved in, and it was important to cut the hoses of the fire brigade just in case the fire didn't continue. And we had, let's be truthful, I'm after finishing a set of exercises as President of Ireland on Mocknav and how our state came to be, and so forth. I will be gone, but the point about it is what happened in the 20s prepared for the terrible 30s. And the 30s were bigoted. The 30s were ones which treated women badly, they treated the poor badly, and so I think it's all necessary to do this if you're to avoid not just Pope Francis's indifference, but the blandness of imagining that we are somehow or another without much effort. It is the effort of people like the celebration that has been so important. I think, as I come to the end of what I'm going to say, there is a new paradigm emerging, I think. It won't be easy. I think the conflicts are breaking into different pieces in fragmented forms. We have a situation where the agency that looks after the poorest and the most broken, in the most broken spots, UNRWA, for example, because 12 of its employees have been knocked out of their jobs correctly, and there's an investigation. There are 30,000 people in UNRWA. There are 13,000 working in Gaza. And in order to satisfy the demand for a few people, some of the richest countries in the world, we will have 570,000 people be in danger of famine. And that's why I have to say, I'm the same as anyone else alive on this planet. And I am absolutely horrified at what is in fact what we're being asked to accept as versions of humanity. I think as well there will be, and my hope is, there will be new arrangements in relation to multinational bodies. There will be, I think, a recurrent, there can be. And indeed, if you take all of the different systems of the world that are transcendental systems, they do have an ethical possibility, an ethical capacity in them. And thankfully, there are the good new writers. We have people like Tim Jackson, Ian Goff, Anna Coote, Mariana Mazzucato, Sylvia Walby, Kate Raworth, Pather Kirby, Mary Murphy. It's written a very, very, very good book in the tradition of the people we're celebrating. So I think we do that. That scholarship is welcome. That scholarship will be very, very, very important. And I think, too, as well, the interesting side of it is that those are bizarre examples I quoted of gross nonsense that I mentioned earlier. They're not really being taken in by the young people. And your conference today, I think that is celebrating something else. This is something else that happens. Maybe in my confused way, I have been trying to combine the local and the global, because we're in fact actually they are connected. And the work of Seán Healy and Sister Brigid did that. And your conference today is an opportunity then to consider social justice with all that new literature being forefronted. I think as well, there are not choices that are that difficult. One can still be entrepreneurial while having, in fact, a commitment to social ethics and inclusion and so forth. I referred to in my speech on the Holocaust where I said in the moral evaluation of one's life is that one has to say one is a migrant in time. What kind of work, what kind of lives do we want? All I know is that lives shared are lives enhanced. And in addition to that, I also hold the view that, which is an eclectic one in a way, that in relation to forms of life, that respecting other species of life and other forms of life is incredibly important. I won't talk about my dog. Now, the point about it is that but we're going through a world, I think, that is in a period of rising politics. This is why when people describe a world and they say, oh, it's rising political authoritarianism, polarization and violence, it need not be if we stop it. And it need not be if we provide the alternative. And the two people we are celebrating today, Seán Healy and Sister Brigid, have spent a half a century doing just that. It's gone Buick Slove, and I thank them from my heart. Good night.